The courthouse stood like an aging sentinel in the center of town, its stone walls weathered by decades of storms and time. To the townspeople, it wasn't just a building of justice. It was the heart of their community, a place where disputes were settled, criminals were judged, and truth was meant to shine. On that particular morning, however, the courthouse was more alive than ever before. Every hallway echoed with footsteps, every bench overflowed with spectators, and the air buzzed with an anticipation that few trials had ever carried. At the center of this storm was the trial of Daniel Hargrove, a man accused of breaking into the suburban home of the Miller family. The incident had left scars too deep to heal quickly. The father, James Miller, had been attacked in his own living room. His wife, Laura, had been brutally injured while trying to protect their only child. And yet, in a cruel twist of fate, the sole uninjured witness to the entire tragedy had been their 3-year-old daughter, Emily. The case had stirred emotions across the small town. Neighbors whispered in grocery stores and gas stations, speculating about what Emily had seen, or whether she had seen anything at all. Some said she was too young to understand. Others believed children noticed more than adults gave them credit for. What no one doubted, however, was the gravity of her presence. For the first time in living memory, a toddler would take the stand in a criminal trial. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick. Journalists had claimed every corner of the press section, their notebooks open and ready, cameras hanging like eager vultures. Locals who had known the Miller family filled the gallery, their faces painted with a mixture of grief, anger, and curiosity. Even those with no direct connection to the case had arrived, drawn by the spectacle of it all. The judge, an older man named Harold Whitmore, tapped his gavel lightly to maintain order. His gray hair framed a stern but weary face. He had seen countless cases, yet even he felt a peculiar unease that day. To preside over a case involving such a young witness felt like walking a tightrope without a net. The prosecution table was stacked with files, photographs, and reports. Assistant District Attorney Claire Donovan stood tall, her sharp eyes scanning the jury box. Claire had a reputation for precision and for never underestimating a witness, no matter how small. She believed in Emily, even when others doubted. Across the aisle, defense attorney Martin Keene adjusted his tie with a smug expression. Keene thrived on poking holes in stories, and he had already made his strategy clear. A child that age can't distinguish between dreams and reality, he had told reporters weeks earlier. This case has no foundation if it leans on her words. His confidence radiated, though some whispered it was the false bravado of a man whose client's guilt weighed heavily in the evidence. At the defendant's table, Daniel Hargrove sat uncomfortably, his hands folded but restless. His eyes darted from one face to another, trying to gauge the tide of opinion in the room. He had pleaded not guilty, but the shadow of suspicion loomed heavily. The prosecution's physical evidence pointed to him shoe prints, fibers, and the trail of a police dog named Max. But physical evidence alone often left room for doubt. The real question was whether Emily, the tiny girl who had lived through the nightmare, could tip the balance. As the court clerk called for order, the jury filed in. 12 ordinary men and women, now entrusted with an extraordinary responsibility, took their seats. Their expressions varied, some curious, some skeptical, others heavy with sympathy. They had all heard the rumors. Emily would testify, but none of them could imagine how. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Whitmore began, his voice steady, "you are here to hear the facts of this case. I remind you that emotion must not guide your verdict. Only truth, proven and tested, will." Despite his warning, emotion clung to every corner of the room. Laura Miller, still recovering from her injuries, sat quietly in the gallery, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. She had agreed to let her daughter testify, though the decision had nearly torn her apart. Every motherly instinct screamed to shield Emily from the trauma, But justice required courage, even from the smallest of voices. The opening statements unfolded with practiced rhythm. Claire Donovan painted the crime scene vividly but respectfully, reminding the jury of the night when terror shattered the Miller home. She spoke of footprints in the mud, of Max, the police dog leading investigators to Hargrove's door, and of the emotional scars left behind. Then she paused, lowering her voice as though confiding in the jurors personally. "You will hear from a witness," Claire said, her eyes sweeping the room. "She is young, yes, but sometimes truth speaks clearest from innocence. Emily Miller was there. She saw, she remembers, and she will tell you what she knows." The gallery shifted uncomfortably, the air suddenly heavier. All eyes flicked toward the little girl sitting quietly with her mother, unaware of the weight her testimony carried. When it was Martin Keene's turn, he strode confidently before the jury. "We all feel sympathy for this child," he said, his tone smooth but edged with calculation. "But sympathy is not evidence. Memory at 3 years old is a fragile, unreliable thing. Would you convict a man based on the words of a toddler who cannot even tell time or recite the alphabet? My client is innocent, and I will show you how shaky the foundation of this case truly is." His words rippled through the jury box, planting seeds of doubt. But doubt alone could not erase the hushed murmurs that followed. Everyone knew the real test was yet to come, the moment when Emily herself would take the stand. As the first witnesses testified, officers describing the crime scene, forensic experts discussing evidence, the anticipation only grew. The jurors listened, but their eyes often drifted to the small figure sitting near her mother. Emily fidgeted with her stuffed rabbit, occasionally swinging her legs or whispering to her mom. She seemed blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around her, though now and then her eyes flickered with shadows only a child who had seen too much could carry. By the time the day neared its climax, the air in the courtroom felt electric. Judge Whitmore leaned toward the clerk and gave a quiet nod. The moment had come. "Bring in the witness," the judge announced. All heads turned as Emily's mother gently helped her daughter to her feet. Holding tightly to her stuffed rabbit, Emily toddled forward toward the stand, her small shoes tapping lightly against the wooden floor. The courtroom grew so silent that even those faint sounds seemed deafening. The bailiff swore her in gently, asking only if she promised to tell the truth. Emily nodded shyly, her big eyes fixed on the rows of faces staring back at her. She climbed into the witness chair, her legs dangling far above the floor. In that moment, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. What could a 3-year-old possibly say? Would she crumble under the weight of so many eyes? Would she speak at all? No one knew. But everyone leaned forward, waiting for the first words of the smallest witness ever to hold a courtroom in suspense. The wooden witness chair seemed far too big for the little girl. Emily sat perched on its edge, her small body half swallowed by the towering backrest. Her stuffed rabbit sat in her lap, its ears chewed and frayed from years of comfort. She clutched it as though it were her shield, a soft barrier between herself and the intimidating sea of faces before her. The courtroom had gone completely still. Even the clicking of reporters' pens had stopped, as though no one dared to make a sound that might frighten the child. The jurors leaned forward unconsciously, their skepticism battling with curiosity. For many of them, this was the first time they had ever seen such a young witness in court. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, trying to soften the moment. His voice, usually stern, gentled as he addressed her. "Hello, Emily," he said. "Do you see your mommy in the room?" Emily looked around shyly, then pointed toward Laura Miller, who sat in the gallery with tears already brimming in her eyes. The judge nodded approvingly. "Good, that's your mommy. Now, all you have to do today is answer a few simple questions." "Can you do that?" Emily nodded, her golden curls bobbing with the movement. At the prosecution table, Claire Donovan exhaled quietly, steadying herself. She knew that questioning Emily required delicacy, precision, and empathy all at once. One wrong tone, one confusing phrase, and the child could retreat into silence. Claire rose slowly, her expression warm and open. "Hi, Emily," Claire began softly. "My name is Claire. Do you remember me?" Emily nodded again, fiddling with her rabbit's ear. "You have the red shoes," she said, her voice high but clear. Laughter rippled lightly through the courtroom, easing some of the tension. Claire smiled, glancing down at her red heels. "That's right, I do. You have a very good memory." Then she leaned a little closer, her tone shifting to one of calm reassurance. "Emily, do you remember when you talked to the nice police officers about what happened at your house?" The child froze for a moment, her big eyes clouding with a memory she couldn't fully name. Her little fingers squeezed the rabbit tighter. "Yes," she whispered at last. Claire nodded. "That's very brave. Can you tell us, were you in your house the night something scary happened?" Emily's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. Yes, the jury held its breath. Even the defense attorney, Martin Keene, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, though he masked it with a practiced smirk. Claire decided to move gently, allowing Emily to set the pace. "Do you remember who was with you that night?" "My mommy, my daddy, and—" She paused, her voice shrinking into silence. "And you," Claire encouraged softly. "You were there too, right?" Emily nodded quickly, as if confirming her own presence made it safer. Across the room, Daniel Hargrove stared at the child, his jaw tightening. He tried to appear calm, but his fingers drummed nervously against the table. He knew the power of innocence, how even a single word from a child could sway hearts more than hours of legal argument. Martin Keene rose suddenly. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp. "This line of questioning risks confusing the witness. The child is clearly too young to give reliable testimony." Judge Whitmore's gavel struck lightly. "Overruled for now. Proceed with caution, Ms. Donovan." Claire inclined her head respectfully and turned back to Emily. She could sense the defense's eagerness to pounce on any misstep. "Emily, can you tell us what you remember?" "Anything at all. You don't have to be afraid." Emily's tiny shoulders rose as she took a shaky breath. Her voice, fragile but steady, carried across the silent courtroom. A bad man came. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Lavra Miller pressed her hands to her mouth, her tears spilling freely. The jurors shifted, their skepticism faltering. Claire bent slightly, her eyes soft. "Emily, when you say bad man, what do you mean?" "He hurt Daddy," Emily replied, her voice cracking on the last word. For a moment, no one in the courtroom moved. The child's words hung in the air like a blade, cutting through layers of doubt. Martin Keene jumped to his feet again. "Objection. She's being led. She doesn't understand what she's saying." The judge's gavel came down harder this time. "Mr. Keene, sit down." The witness is answering in her own words. The jury's expressions were changing. What had once been a wall of skepticism now showed cracks of belief, their eyes reflecting sympathy, horror, and dawning conviction. Claire straightened, her voice calm but purposeful. "Emily, did you see the bad man's face?" Emily frowned, her small brow furrowing as she clutched her rabbit tighter. "No, he was scary. He was loud. But Max found him." The room tensed. Murmurs rippled again. Max, the police dog. Claire froze, not expecting Emily to bring up the dog so soon. She glanced quickly at the judge, then at the defense, who was already scribbling furiously on a yellow pad. "Emily," Claire asked carefully, "who is Max?" Emily's eyes brightened just a little. "The doggy." She pointed toward the back of the courtroom, where Max sat calmly with his handler. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his name. It was a small moment, but its impact was seismic. For the first time, Emily had drawn a clear connection between the terrifying night and the police dog who had tracked the suspect. The defense attorney leapt up once more. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The child is speaking nonsense. You cannot allow this to influence the jury." But even as he argued, the jury's eyes were locked on Emily, and on Max. Their expressions revealed a silent truth. Children might stumble with details, but they rarely invented fear. The judge raised a hand, silencing the defense. "The witness has answered." "Continue, Miss Donovan." Claire's heart raced. She knew she had to tread carefully. Emily's testimony was already more powerful than she had dared hope. And yet, the most crucial words were still to come. Emily's little hand rested protectively on her stuffed rabbit. Her voice trembled, but she looked straight at Max again, as though the memory had snapped into place. "Max found the bad man," she whispered. Gasps broke out across the courtroom. Even Claire, who had prepared herself for weeks, felt chills race up her arms. The stage was set. What Emily had just said was only the beginning. The real shock was yet to unfold. The courtroom was still vibrating with the echoes of Emily's tiny voice. Max found the bad man. Those words had landed with the weight of a gavel. The jurors exchanged glances. The spectators whispered nervously, and the defense attorney scribbled so furiously his pen nearly tore the paper. For all his confidence, Martin Keene knew this testimony had struck a chord too raw to ignore. Judge Whitmore tapped his gavel once. "Order, please. The witness will continue." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Even a veteran judge understood the power of an innocent child's words. At the back of the room, Max stirred. The German shepherd had been waiting with his handler, Officer Grant, his dark coat sleek under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Though trained to sit quietly, Max seemed to sense the rising tension. His ears perked, and his amber eyes locked onto Emily at the stand. "Your Honor," Claire Donovan said carefully, "given the witness's statement, I request that the jury be permitted to see." Officer Grant and Canine Max enter the courtroom. The defense shot up immediately. "Objection. This is theater. You're parading a dog in here to sway emotion, not present facts." Claire remained calm, her voice sharp with resolve. "This animal is not a prop, Mr. Keene. He is an officer of the law." He tracked the scent from the Miller home directly to the defendant's residence. And now, the witness herself has connected him to that night. The jury deserves to see the connection firsthand. The judge hesitated. His gavel tapped lightly, a nervous habit. He knew allowing the dog inside risked accusations of bias, but he also recognized the prosecution's point. Slowly, he nodded. "Objection overruled. Officer Grant, bring in the K9." The doors opened, and all heads turned. Max padded forward with the steady stride of a soldier. His handler held the leash loosely, confident in the dog's discipline. A hush fell over the gallery. Even the journalists lowered their pens to watch. Emily's eyes widened the moment she saw him. The stuffed rabbit in her lap slipped slightly as her small hand instinctively reached forward, though distance kept her from touching him. "Max," she whispered, her voice soft but unmistakable. The murmur that rose from the crowd this time was louder, more electric. Gasps, whispers, even a few muffled cries of surprise. Claire took a step closer to the stand, her heart pounding. "Emily," she said gently, "do you recognize this dog?" Emily nodded eagerly, for the first time forgetting her shyness. "Yes, Max." The little girl's voice was so clear, so filled with certainty, that it struck harder than any adult testimony ever could. The defense attorney scrambled to recover, standing so abruptly his chair screeched. Your Honor, I object again. This child has been influenced. She's 3 years old. She probably saw the dog in the news. Or, the judge slammed his gavel harder this time. Mr. Keene, sit down. The witness is answering in her own words. The jury will decide what to make of it. Martin's jaw tightened, but he obeyed, though his eyes flashed with frustration. Officer Grant stopped near the front of the courtroom, Max sitting obediently at his side. The dog's gaze never left Emily. It was as if he recognized her too. Claire knelt slightly, bringing herself closer to Emily's eye level. Can you tell us how you know Max? Emily clutched her rabbit, her small legs swinging nervously, but her words came without hesitation. Max came to my house. He sniffed everything. Then he barked at the bad man's door. The jury erupted in hushed whispers again, the impact undeniable. These were not the words of a rehearsed witness. They were the fragmented, honest recollections of a child who had experienced something unforgettable. Claire glanced quickly at the jury, noting the way their skepticism had melted into wide-eyed focus. She turned back to Emily, speaking softly. Emily, what happened when Max barked? Emily's brow furrowed as though remembering. She pointed toward the defense table with her tiny finger, her hand trembling but determined. The bad man was inside. The gasp that followed was louder than before. It surged through the courtroom like a wave. Journalists scribbled furiously. Jurors stared with parted lips, and the spectators craned forward as if they might miss the next breath. Daniel Hargrove stiffened in his seat, his face paling. His attorney leaned close, whispering harshly, but his client's eyes never left the little girl pointing directly at him. Your Honor? Martin Keene barked, standing once more. His voice was desperate now, the polished calm cracking. This is completely inadmissible. She's pointing at my client because she's been told he's the bad man. This entire charade is poisoning the jury. The judge raised his gavel again, but the sound of the crowd drowned it momentarily. He struck harder, his voice booming. Order, order in the court. The room reluctantly quieted, though the charged air remained. The jury, however, could not erase what they had seen. A child, unprompted, pointing to the man accused. Claire remained standing, her composure steady, though her pulse thundered. She hadn't expected Emily to be so direct, so fearless. But innocence had its own kind of courage. Emily, Claire asked, lowering her voice to a whisper the microphone barely caught. Why did you call him the bad man? Emily blinked, her eyes flicking from Max to the defendant, then back again. Her answer was simple, stripped of complexity, spoken with the clarity only a child could manage. Because Max knows. And I know too. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of boredom or doubt. It was the silence of shock, of realization, of collective breath held all at once. Even Judge Whitmore, his gavel still in hand, froze for a fraction of a second longer than usual. He knew this moment would be etched into the memory of everyone present. Martin Keene slumped into his chair, his face a storm of frustration and dread. His carefully built defense strategy was unraveling in front of his eyes, torn apart not by expert testimony or forensic charts, but by the unwavering innocence of a 3-year-old child and the loyalty of a dog. In the gallery, Lavra Miller's tears flowed freely now, but they were no longer only tears of grief. They carried relief, pride, and something like hope. She whispered softly, though only those nearest heard, "That's my brave girl." The courtroom buzzed with tension, the weight of Emily's words hanging in the air. But everyone sensed it. The story was not finished. Something more was coming. The prosecutor, the defense, the jury, they all knew that the next moments could decide everything. And as Emily lowered her hand, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, the stage was set for the words that would shock not only the courtroom, but the entire town. The hush that settled over the courtroom was unlike any silence before. It was not the quiet of routine testimony or a judge's command. It was the silence of suspense, the collective holding of breath before something irreversible. On the witness stand, Emily sat with her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, remained fixed on Max. The German shepherd hadn't moved, but his steady gaze seemed to give the child a strange kind of courage. She swung her legs slowly, the rhythm calming her as she tried to summon the words hidden behind her trembling lips. Claire Donovan, sensing the fragility of the moment, spoke with infinite gentleness. "Emily," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "you said Max knows. Can you tell us what you mean?" Emily's gaze shifted from Max to the defendant. Her little finger rose again, unsteady at first, then unwavering. She pointed directly at Daniel Hargrove. The room seemed to shrink, pulling all focus to the tiny hand aimed at the accused. Emily's lips parted. Her voice, though high and childlike, carried a clarity that pierced the air. "Bad man?" The words echoed as though the walls themselves repeated them. For a moment, the courtroom was paralyzed. No one moved. No one breathed. Then the silence broke, shattered by gasps that rippled through the gallery like a wave crashing onto shore. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching furiously against paper. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, their expressions betraying a shift that no lawyer's argument could undo. Lavra Miller clutched her face in her hands, sobbing quietly but uncontrollably. At the defense table, Daniel Hargrove jolted upright, his composure cracking. His mouth opened as though to protest, but no words came. His lawyer, Martin Keene, leapt to his feet in fury. "Objection! Objection, Your Honor!" he shouted, his voice shaking with more desperation than authority. "This is outrageous. This child, this toddler, she's parroting words she doesn't understand. You cannot allow this testimony to poison the jury." Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel, but his usually steady hand trembled. "Order! Order in the court!" The gavel struck again and again, yet the murmurs and whispers refused to die completely. The gravity of what had just happened was too powerful to suppress. Claire Donovan did not move. She stood frozen, watching Emily, knowing full well that no amount of cross-examination could erase the impact of those two simple words. She had expected strength from the child, but this raw clarity surpassed every hope. When the room finally settled enough for the judge to speak, his voice was grave. "Miss Donovan, proceed carefully." Claire nodded and turned back to Emily. "Emily," she said softly, "can you tell us why you called him a bad man?" The little girl hugged her rabbit tighter, as though drawing strength from its worn fabric. "Because he hurt Daddy, and Max told me." Gasps erupted again, but Claire held up her hand, keeping her voice steady. "Emily, can you tell us what Max did that night?" Emily's brow furrowed as she searched her memory. "Max came with the policeman. He sniffed. He barked at the bad man's house. That's how I know." The jurors were spellbound. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the purity of conviction that only a child could carry. There was no guile, no agenda, only truth. The defense attorney's face reddened as he scrambled. "Your Honor, I demand the jury be instructed to disregard this testimony. The child has clearly been influenced. Dogs don't talk, she's mixing fantasy with reality." The judge's gavel slammed again. "The objection is noted. However, the jury will weigh the credibility of the witness as they see fit." The defense attorney's jaw clenched. He sat slowly, his confidence unraveling, his carefully rehearsed strategy collapsing like sandcastles under a rising tide. Claire's eyes softened as she gave Emily one last question. "Emily, can you tell us who the bad man is?" Emily didn't hesitate. Her little hand lifted again, her finger steady as a blade. She pointed at Daniel Hargrove. Hargrove's face drained of color. For the first time, he looked less like a man defending himself and more like a man cornered. His hands, once folded neatly on the table, now trembled against the polished wood. The jury watched him as much as they watched Emily. His reaction spoke volumes his lawyer couldn't explain away. In the gallery, whispers grew louder. Some spectators wept openly. Others shook their heads in disbelief, murmuring to each other about the weight of what they had just witnessed. Reporters dashed notes with frantic urgency, already imagining tomorrow's headline. Courtroom gasps as 3-year-old identifies. Police dogs, bad man. Judge Whitmore finally leaned forward, his voice grave. The witness has spoken. Court will recess for 15 minutes. The gavel struck. But no one rose immediately. The jury sat stunned, the gallery buzzing, and the defendant frozen. Only Emily moved. She slid from the witness chair, clutching her rabbit, and walked back to her mother. Lavra scooped her up, pressing her face into her daughter's curls, whispering words of comfort through tears. Max, still sitting beside Officer Grant, wagged his tail once, quietly, as though acknowledging the courage of the smallest witness in the room. When the jurors filed out for recess, their expressions were unmistakable. They had been shaken, not by complex legal arguments or forensic details, but by 2 words that carried more weight than any evidence chart or expert opinion could. And though the trial was far from over, the tide had turned. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. When Judge Whitmore's gavel echoed to announce the recess, it was as if the courtroom had suddenly been released from a spell. The gallery erupted not with cheers or jeers, but with frantic, breathless whispers that carried the energy of a thunderstorm. Reporters bolted from their benches, phones to their ears, dictating frantic notes to editors. "You won't believe this," one hissed into his recorder. The little girl just pointed at the police dog and said, "Bad man." The defendant's face God. It was like he'd seen a ghost. Pens scratched, cameras clicked, and every journalist present knew they had a front-page story before the trial was even over. The jurors shuffled into their private room, but they carried with them more than notepads. They carried the image of Emily, small and fragile, pointing her finger with unshakable certainty. Inside the deliberation chamber, silence stretched uncomfortably. No one dared to speak aloud, but their eyes revealed what they felt. Something profound had shifted. Back in the courtroom, the defense team was in chaos. Martin Keene, usually sharp and unflappable, was pacing like a caged animal. His client, Daniel Hargrove, leaned close, whispering furiously, his voice cracked with panic. "She's 3 years old, Martin. 3. How can they believe her?" His hands trembled against the table, sweat glistening on his brow. Keene snapped his head toward him. "It's not about what she said, it's about how she said it. The jury saw your face, Daniel. You looked guilty. You reacted. I told you control your expressions. I didn't expect her to," Hargrove stammered, his words tangled in fear. "How was I supposed to know they'd bring that damn dog into the courtroom?" Keene pressed his palms against his forehead. "You don't get it. That wasn't just testimony. It was theater. The prosecution turned your trial into a stage, and that kid delivered the performance of a lifetime. Every juror's going to remember her voice more than any lab report I bring up." Across the aisle, Claire Donovan sat motionless, her hands folded, her expression calm, but her heart racing. She didn't allow herself a smile. It would have seemed smug, disrespectful even. But inside, she knew. Emily had shifted the momentum in ways no strategy session could have planned. Officer Grant bent down to stroke Max's head. The German shepherd leaned into his handler, eyes still steady and alert. Grant whispered, "Good boy," though Max had done nothing more than sit quietly and be remembered. The recess ended. The gavel struck once more, calling everyone back into the charged atmosphere. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom obeyed. The jury filed back in, faces grave, lips pressed tightly shut. Each of them avoided looking at the defendant. It was subtle, but undeniable. Even Keene noticed, and the sight made his stomach twist. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. His voice was measured, but anyone could hear the heaviness behind it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, before we continue, I remind you that while emotional testimony may be powerful, your verdict must rest on evidence and the law." His eyes lingered on the jury longer than usual, as though trying to re-anchor them in objectivity. Yet even he knew objectivity was fragile when a child's innocence pierced through the air like that. Keene rose immediately. "Your Honor, at this time, the defense moved for Emily Miller's testimony to be stricken from the record. She is a minor, barely a toddler, incapable of understanding truth from fiction." What this court witnessed was not credible testimony, but an emotional display designed to prejudice the jury. Gasps rippled through the gallery again. Lavra Miller, Emily's mother, stiffened in her seat, clutching her daughter tightly. Claire shot to her feet. "Your Honor, the defense insults not only this child, but the very essence of truth." Emily recognized Max instantly, months after the event. She made a spontaneous identification of the defendant, without coaching, hesitation, or prompting. Her testimony is not only relevant, it is essential. Keene slammed his palm against the table. "She said the dog told her." Are we really going to put a man's future in the hands of a child who thinks animals talk? The courtroom tensed. All eyes turned to Judge Whitmore, who exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose before speaking. "The motion to strike is denied. The jury will determine the weight of the testimony." Keene's jaw tightened. He sat heavily, scribbling notes with a fury that tore into the paper. His strategy had been gutted. Claire approached the witness stand one last time, but Emily had already been escorted out, her role complete. Instead, Claire addressed the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you saw it. You heard it. Those were not rehearsed lines, not carefully staged drama. Those were the unfiltered words of a child who has no reason to lie, no motive to deceive. The truth came out of her mouth with clarity that cuts deeper than any cross-examination could. You may be asked to doubt her. You may be told she is too young. But ask yourselves, when did truth ever need an age?" A hush settled again. The jurors shifted, some biting their lips, others staring at the defendant with newfound suspicion. Daniel Hargrove's face was pale. His hands fidgeted constantly, betraying the calm exterior he once tried so hard to maintain. His eyes darted to the jury, to the judge, then back to Claire, as though searching desperately for escape. Meanwhile, the gallery was alive with energy. A man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That little girl just sank him." Another muttered, "God help him. There's no way out after this." The media frenzy outside the courthouse was already building. Television vans parked along the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward. Anchors rehearsed their lines. A courtroom turned upside down today, as a 3-year-old witness identified the accused in a shocking twist of testimony. Inside, Judge Whitmore called for closing the day's session, but the case no longer belonged only to the lawyers or the judge. It belonged to Emily, the image of her small hand pointing, the clarity of her 2 words, and the instinctive belief that innocence rarely lies. When the gavel fell for the final time that day, the weight of it seemed heavier than ever before. Everyone in the courtroom understood. The shockwaves of Emily's testimony would not fade overnight. They would reverberate through the trial, through the town, and through every headline in the nation. And for Daniel Hargrove, the tide of justice had begun to turn against him in ways he could never have imagined. The courtroom the next morning carried a different energy. Where before there had been uncertainty some, leaning toward doubt, some toward belief. Now there was tension so thick it seemed to hang in the air like fog. Spectators whispered as they filed into the benches. Reporters sat poised with their pens hovering, cameras already flashing at every movement. But the ones most visibly changed were the jurors. Their faces, once neutral and unreadable, now bore the faintest traces of what they had witnessed the day before. The tremor of awe, the shadow of sympathy, the quiet conviction that something simple yet profound had just taken place. Claire Donovan knew it. She read it in their eyes as she arranged her files at the prosecution's table. But she didn't allow herself the arrogance of certainty. A trial was never won on one moment, no matter how powerful. She needed to take Emily's raw, emotional testimony and carefully weave it into the framework of facts and evidence. When Judge Whitmore entered and the courtroom rose, his expression was stern, though the faint weariness in his eyes betrayed him. He had spent half the night replaying Emily's words, reminding himself over and over that a judge must not be swayed by sympathy. Yet even he could not erase the sound of that tiny voice, saying, "Bad man." The session resumed, with Claire calling Officer Grant to the stand once more, with Max at his side. The German shepherd sat calmly, his ears pricked, his body poised like the trained professional he was. The courtroom seemed to soften when the dog entered, as though his steady presence was a reminder of reliability amid human chaos. "Officer Grant," Claire began, her tone measured and respectful. "Yesterday, this court heard testimony from Emily Miller. I'd like to follow up on what she shared about Max. Can you explain, in your own words, the role Max played in this investigation?" Grant nodded, his voice clear. "Yes, ma'am. On the night of the incident, Max was deployed to track the scent left at the Miller residence. He led us directly from the scene to the property of the defendant, Daniel Hargrove. Max identified the scent with absolute consistency. He never faltered, never diverted. He confirmed the same result in multiple controlled tests afterward." Claire paced slowly, letting each word settle. "In your professional opinion, Officer Grant, could Emily have fabricated her memory of Max's actions?" "No," Grant said firmly. "Children don't invent the kind of details she shared. She remembered what happened because she saw it. She remembered Max because he was there. That's not imagination, that's recognition." The jury scribbled notes. A woman in the front row tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. Claire leaned in. "Would you say Max's identification and Emily's recognition support each other?" "Yes," Grant replied. "They're two pieces of the same truth." Martin Keene leapt to his feet, adjusting his suit with deliberate annoyance. "Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness." "Sustained," Judge Whitmore said, though his tone lacked conviction. He gestured for Claire to proceed more carefully. She turned back to the jury, lowering her voice. No further questions. When Keene rose for cross-examination, his usual confidence was thinner, stretched taut like a fraying rope. He fixed his gaze on the officer. "Officer Grant," he began, "you expect this jury to believe that a child who talks to stuffed animals and claims dogs tell her things can provide credible testimony." Grant did not flinch. "I expect this jury to believe what they saw with their own eyes. Emily recognized Max because Max played a real role in her life during the investigation." Keene smirked bitterly. "So the jury should convict a man based on the word of a toddler and the bark of a dog?" The courtroom tensed. Some jurors frowned at his tone. A few scribbled again, though less feverishly. "No," Grant replied calmly. "The jury should convict based on evidence. And Emily's words support the evidence we already gathered." Keene's jaw tightened. He ended his questions quickly, returning to his table with an air of defeat. Claire seized the opening. She requested the court play footage from the night of the search body cam recordings of Max tracking the scent, leading officers directly to Hargrove's shed. The grainy video filled the courtroom with heavy silence. The jurors leaned forward, watching Max pull on his lead, barking as he pawed at the shed door. Then came the moment. Officers prying open the door, finding items linked directly to the Miller family. Laura's broken watch, Emily's missing blanket, speckled with stains, later confirmed his blood. The jurors exchanged looks. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. The evidence, paired with Emily's words, formed a chain difficult to break. When the video ended, Claire approached the jury with quiet conviction. Yesterday, you heard the voice of innocence. Today, you see the proof that innocence remembered true. Emily didn't come here to spin stories. She didn't come here to win a case. She came here because she was the only survivor of a night that changed her life forever. And when she saw Max, she remembered what we all must never forget, that the truth finds its way out, no matter how small the voice that carries it. Her words hung in the air, solemn and steady. The jury sat in rapt silence. For the first time, even the spectators refrained from whispering. The power of Emily's testimony, buttressed by cold, hard evidence, now loomed like a shadow over the defense. Keene knew it. He could feel it slipping through his fingers, the narrative, the control, the very lifeblood of his case. He scribbled furiously, but no strategy came. Each time he glanced at his client, Hargrove's panicked expression made his task even harder. The man looked less like someone wrongfully accused and more like someone exposed. Judge Whitmore finally called for the noon recess. As the gavel fell, the room released a collective breath it hadn't realized it was holding. In the gallery, Lavra Miller held Emily close, whispering praise. The child's eyes sparkled with a simple joy, oblivious to the magnitude of what she had done. To her, it was all simple. Max was her friend. Max found the bad man, and she had told the truth. For the jury, that simplicity was both haunting and undeniable. As the courtroom emptied, one truth settled over everyone present. Innocence had spoken, and innocence rarely lies. And no matter what arguments were yet to come, those two little words, bad man, would continue echoing in every corner of their minds. The trial had reached its final stage. Days of testimony, weeks of preparation, and months of investigation now funneled into one decisive moment, the closing arguments. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled, the gallery packed with townsfolk, journalists, and observers who had followed the case since its opening day. Jurors filed in, their faces tense and weary, but attentive. They knew what lay ahead, the speeches that would crystallize everything they had seen and heard. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. "Counselors," he said, "you may proceed with your closing statements. Defense, you may begin." Martin Keene rose slowly, tugging at his suit jacket, his face stern, but betraying a glint of desperation in his eyes. He approached the jury box with deliberate steps, pausing for effect before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "this case is not about sympathy. It is not about emotion. It is not about the tragedy that befell the Miller family, as heartbreaking as it is. This case is about facts. Facts, and only facts, should guide you to your verdict." He paced slowly, gesturing with his hands. "Now, ask yourselves, what facts did the prosecution truly provide? A child's testimony. A 3-year-old child barely old enough to understand truth from fantasy. Did you see how she clutched her toy rabbit? Did you hear her say the dog told her who the bad man was? Ladies and gentlemen, are we now convicting men based on fairy tales?" His words stirred murmurs in the gallery. Some nodded, others frowned. The jurors, however, remained silent, pens scratching faintly against notepads. Keene pressed on. "The prosecution will try to convince you that innocence equals truth. But innocence also equals imagination. Children make things up. They misremember. They dream. What you saw in that courtroom was not evidence. It was emotion. And if you let emotion decide this case, you undermine the very foundation of justice. He stopped and turned sharply toward the prosecution's table. They want you to see a monster. But what evidence do they really have? A dog's nose? A child's words? This is not science, it is spectacle. Keen's voice grew louder, his hands slicing through the air. You have a duty, a sacred duty. And that duty is not to feel, not to pity, but to judge based on reason. The burden is not on my client to prove his innocence. The burden is on the state to prove his guilt. And I submit to you that they have failed. He leaned closer to the jury, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Don't let tragedy cloud your judgment. Don't let sympathy sway your reason. Today, the only just verdict is not guilty. Keen stepped back, his face flushed, his breath heavy. He adjusted his jacket once more and returned to his seat, avoiding his client's anxious stare. The room buzzed with tension. Then, slowly, Claire Donovan rose. She walked with calm assurance, carrying no notes, no props, just the weight of truth she had carried since day one. She stood before the jury, her hands clasped, her eyes steady. Ladies and gentlemen, she began softly, you've heard a lot these past few weeks. Expert testimony, forensic reports, police accounts. But through it all, one voice has stayed with you. A voice so small it could barely reach the microphone. A voice that had no reason to deceive you, no motive to manipulate you. The voice of Emily Miller. She paused, allowing the name to linger. The jury's eyes softened, several leaning forward. Emily didn't ask to be here, Claire continued. She didn't ask to relive the worst night of her life. She didn't ask to stand in a courtroom, clutching her rabbit, facing the man who took everything from her. But she came here. And when she saw Max, she remembered. She remembered the truth. And she told you that truth in the only way she knew how. 2 simple words. Bad man? Her tone sharpened. The defense wants you to believe that innocence clouds truth. I say innocence clarifies it. Because innocence has no agenda. Innocence doesn't calculate or strategize. Innocence simply speaks. She gestured toward Max, lying quietly at Officer Grant's side. The evidence supports her. Max tracked the scent. He led officers to the defendant's shed, where belongings of the Miller family were found. You saw the video. You saw the evidence. You saw the defendant's reaction when Emily pointed at him. That was not the reaction of an innocent man. Claire stepped closer to the jury box, her voice dropping into a tone of raw sincerity. I ask you, what reason would a 3-year-old have to lie? What reason would she have to point at a man she does not know, to call him the bad man, unless he was? This is not imagination. This is not fantasy. This is the truth, spoken from the mouth of a child who has seen too much. She let her gaze travel across each juror's face. You are not here to pity Emily. You are here to deliver justice for her father, for her family, and for the truth she bravely shared. Do not let fear or doubt or clever words cloud what you know in your hearts and minds. The defendant is guilty, and you have the power to make sure he never hurts another family again. Her final words rang with quiet conviction. Justice does not belong to the powerful or the clever. Justice belongs to the innocent. And today, the innocent has spoken. Claire stepped back, her eyes never leaving the jury until she returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent, utterly silent. A kind of silence that follows a truth too powerful to immediately react to. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice solemn. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have now heard the closing statements from both sides. You will retire to deliberate. The gavel struck. The jury stood, filing out in silence, their expressions unreadable. But everyone in that courtroom knew. Their hearts carried Emily's voice, echoing with two haunting words. And now, justice itself hung in the balance. The jury room was quiet at first. 12 men and women sat in a circle, their faces drawn, their minds heavy with the weight of responsibility. No one wanted to be the first to speak. They had all seen and heard the same things, evidence, testimony, arguments, but what lingered strongest wasn't the lawyers or the reports. It was Emily. A middle-aged juror broke the silence. "I can't get her voice out of my head. Bad man." She said it so clear. Another juror, a schoolteacher, nodded. "Children that young don't fake that kind of conviction." She wasn't coached. She wasn't confused. She recognized him. But a man at the far end of the table frowned. "We can't just convict on emotion." The defense made a point. "She's only 3 years old. Kids say all kinds of things." The teacher leaned forward. "Yes, but the dog backed her up. The video, the evidence in the shed, all of it lines up. Are we supposed to ignore the facts because we're afraid of believing a child?" The debate stretched for hours, voices rising and falling, conviction clashing with doubt. But slowly, piece by piece, the truth became undeniable. The scent trail, the blood-stained blanket, the defendant's reaction under pressure, and above all, the innocent clarity of Emily's words, everything pointed in one direction. When they finally knocked on the door to announce a decision, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Spectators packed the benches, reporters poised with cameras and pens. Lavra Miller sat clutching Emily in her arms, rocking her gently. Emily, blissfully unaware of the magnitude of the moment, hummed softly to her stuffed rabbit. Daniel Hargrove sat at the defense table, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the jury box. His attorney, Martin Keene, whispered instructions, but his words seemed to wash over the defendant without meaning. "All rise," the bailiff called as the jury filed in. Judge Whitmore looked over the panel, his face solemn. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The clerk approached, taking the slip of paper, and read aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Hargrove, guilty of murder in the first degree." The words fell like thunder. Gasps filled the room. Reporters dashed notes, cameras clicked furiously, and Lavra Miller collapsed into tears, clutching Emily to her chest. Emily looked up in confusion at her mother's sobs. "Mommy, it's okay," she whispered, patting her mother's cheek. "The bad man won't come back now." Lavra kissed her daughter's forehead, her tears falling freely. "No, baby. He won't." At the defense table, Hargrove's composure crumbled. His shoulders sagged, his hands clenched into fists that trembled with rage and fear. Keene placed a hand on his arm, whispering about appeals, but it was hollow comfort. The tide had turned too strongly. Officer Grant knelt beside Max, who sat tall and steady. "Good boy," Grant whispered again, emotion thick in his voice. Max wagged his tail once, as if acknowledging the moment. Judge Whitmore, his gavel heavy in hand, addressed the jury. "Thank you for your service. This court owes you a debt of gratitude. Justice is never easy, but today you fulfilled your duty with integrity." He turned to the defendant. "Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and with it, the trial was over. But the story was far from finished. Outside the courthouse, the steps were a sea of cameras, reporters, and onlookers. Microphones jutted into every open space, anchors shouted into live broadcasts, and the words "courtroom gasps" as 3-year-old identifies bad man blazed across news tickers. Claire Donovan emerged into the crowd, flanked by officers, her expression calm but resolute. Reporters fired questions, but she offered only a measured response. Justice has spoken. Today, a brave child and a loyal dog reminded us that truth can come from the unlikeliest of voices. That is all. She slipped away before the frenzy could consume her. Laura carried Emily down the steps, shielding her from the flashes of cameras. "Mommy, why are there so many people?" Emily asked, her voice innocent and curious. "Because they wanted to hear your story," Laura said softly. "Because you were brave," Emily giggled. Max was brave too. She waved at the dog, who wagged his tail in return. A silent exchange between survivor and protector. The town itself would never forget the trial. For weeks, newspapers carried the image of Emily, pointing her small finger. Headlines praising her courage. Television anchors called her the youngest witness in state history. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, sending love, prayers, and stuffed animals. But beyond the media storm, the true legacy of the trial lay in the quiet moments. In the way, jurors later admitted they had been moved by her honesty more than any lawyer's speech. In the way, Max became a symbol of loyalty and justice, receiving a medal from the police department for his service. In the way, Lavra finally slept peacefully, knowing her daughter was safe. And in the way, Emily, too young to fully understand the scale of her bravery, simply went back to being a child drawing pictures, playing with dolls, and sometimes telling her stuffed rabbit about the day Max helped. For Daniel Hargrove, life moved in the opposite direction. He was led from the courthouse in shackles, his future sealed by 2 words that no lawyer could erase. His name would forever be remembered not as a victim of circumstance, but as the man undone by the clarity of a child's truth. For the community, the trial became more than a case. It became a story. A story retold in classrooms, in news reports, in living rooms late at night. A story of how the smallest voice and the quiet strength of a dog brought justice when doubt threatened to prevail. And for history, it stood as a reminder that sometimes the law bends under the weight of complexity, but justice finds its way through innocence. Long after the verdict, the echoes of that day still lingered in the courthouse halls. The bench where Emily had sat seemed somehow sacred, as though her words had etched themselves into the wood. And those who had been their jurors, lawyers, reporters, townsfolk knew they had witnessed something rare, something extraordinary. Not just a verdict, not just justice, but the triumph of innocence over doubt. And it all began with a 3-year-old girl, a loyal dog, and 2 words that changed everything. Bad man